Victorian London liked to see itself as civilized, disciplined, and morally pure. In daylight, everything seemed carefully arranged to support that illusion. High collars concealed the body. Gentlemen bowed with polished restraint. Women moved beneath layers of fabric and expectation. From pulpits, in drawing rooms and across family tables, society preached virtue with relentless confidence. But the moment night descended, another city began to emerge from behind that carefully tailored mask. Desire did not vanish with darkness. It moved through alleyways, crept into cheap lodging houses, passed behind brothel curtains, and entered locked rooms where respectability no longer dared to look. And there, sex was not celebrated as intimacy or pleasure. It became a transaction, a secret, a risk, something paid for with money, health, dignity, a reputation, and at times with human life itself. So let us be clear from the beginning. This is not a story of romance, and it is certainly not a story of Victorian decency. It is a story about silence, about a culture so terrified of its own desires that it buried them beneath ritual, denial, and moral performance, until hypocrisy became one of its most powerful institutions. This is what sex in Victorian London truly looked like. Not elegant, not hidden in the way we are often taught to imagine, and above all, not safe. One of the greatest myths we inherit about the Victorian era is the belief that because society was outwardly conservative, sex itself must have been rare. We look at portraits of solemn gentlemen and ladies in high-necked silk and assume we are seeing restraint made visible. Official history often reinforces this image, telling us that this was an age so rigid that even the lightest touch could be scandalous. But beneath that polished surface was something far less controlled. 19th century London was an enormous human machine, overcrowded, restless, and dangerously compressed. The Industrial Revolution had crammed masses of people into confined districts, turning privacy into a luxury that many could never afford. In places such as Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Southwark, immigrants, dock workers, sailors, widows, laborers, and the unemployed were packed into narrow streets and lodging houses where a single room might hold a dozen bodies or more. In that world of poverty, damp walls, and coal smoke fog, sex did not retreat into secrecy. It spilled into the streets and became one of the most desperate currencies the city possessed. In districts like Haymarket, Covent Garden, and along the Strand, prostitution was not hidden away in some invisible underworld. It operated openly in the night air, on pavements near taverns and theaters, in spaces everyone knew how to see and pretended not to understand. Many of the women involved were not simply brothel women in the way later imagination would flatten them. They were flower sellers, barmaids, widows, underpaid workers, or women with nowhere else to go, exchanging sex for rent, for food, for warmth, or for one more night under a roof. And in the poorer eastern quarters of the city, these exchanges often happened in filthy rooms where privacy did not exist at all, only a torn mattress, a rotting floor, and the cold expectation that by morning life would continue as though nothing had happened. That is why one of the biggest mistakes we make is calling this an underground world. It was not underground. It was visible. The police knew. Landlords knew. Theater crowds knew. The city knew. Victorian society was not blind to what stood only a few steps beyond its main roads. It simply refused to name it. And that refusal is the real heart of this story. Victorian conservatism was not moral strength. It was a mask, one that protected appearances while abandoning the vulnerable. Because when a society forbids honest speech about sex, It does not erase desire. It only removes truth, protection, and mercy. And when silence rules, darkness becomes lawless. That is when sex becomes most dangerous. And in that silence, it was always the most vulnerable who paid first. The map of desire in Victorian London was not hidden. It was divided. One of the greatest misconceptions about prostitution in this period is the belief that it belonged only to the lowest layers of society. The truth was far harsher. Desire in London followed a rigid social geography, and sex was shaped by class as clearly as wealth, dress, and address. The city moved according to two parallel maps. On the same night, at the same hour, two separate Londons existed side by side, rarely touching except in the logic of exploitation. In districts such as Haymarket and Covent Garden, sex appeared dressed in velvet and silk, accompanied by the soft ring of crystal and polished manners. Establishments like Kate Hamilton's or Mott's were not tucked away in hidden corners. They stood in full view near theaters, restaurants, and fashionable drinking houses, woven directly into the leisure world of the wealthy. These were places designed for men with money. Inside, candlelight softened every surface. Heavy velvet curtains framed the rooms, carpets muffled footsteps, and champagne flowed with calculated ease. The courtesans here did not sell only their bodies. They sold conversation, elegance, social ease, and the illusion of aristocratic intimacy. Dressed in Parisian silk, surrounded by luxury, they moved with practiced confidence among politicians, officers, businessmen, and gentlemen who expected desire to arrive wrapped in refinement. And many of them would eventually be guided upstairs or away into private rooms draped in deep red velvet, where crystal chandeliers shone through the haze of Havana cigar smoke. Wide gowns brushed across thick carpets, and transactions worth enormous sums were concealed beneath the language of taste and discretion. Everything in these spaces was arranged to resemble culture, sophistication, and pleasure, so that no one ever had to speak plainly about what was actually being bought. Yet only a few streets away, London transformed completely. Step into Seven Dials or Ratcliffe Highway, and sex no longer resembles luxury. It becomes survival in its rawest form. Here, in filthy lodging houses, bodies were packed together on flea-ridden mattresses, with barely enough room to turn, let alone live with dignity. In such places, a young woman might sell herself not for jewelry or fine wine, but simply for one dry corner to sleep in, a bowl of hot soup, or the chance to avoid the street for a single night. There were no velvet curtains here, no sparkling glasses, no polished laughter. There was only the smell of cheap gin, the damp rot of collapsing walls, and the harsh scrape of horses' hooves over cobblestones slick with filth. The alleys were so narrow and airless that even the fog seemed trapped inside them. Hollow faces appeared and disappeared behind broken windows, while shaking hands exchanged dirty copper coins in silence. The walk between Haymarket and Seven Dials might take only a few minutes, but the distance between these two worlds cannot be measured physically. One form of sex was protected by status, money, and social theater. The other was abandoned to disease, violence, and police control. In the hand-drawn illustrations of the period, it was almost always the brighter London that survived on paper. The other city, the one where countless women endured by selling their bodies, was pushed out of sight, not because it was rare, but because polite society considered it too ugly to acknowledge. So while the elite transformed desire into something elegant and almost artistic, the poor were crushed beneath the weight of that same desire. London did not truly operate with two moral systems. It operated with one ruthless rule: money. With money, a man could buy privacy, protection, and the illusion of innocence. Without it, sex became exposure, punishment, and a road that led, with frightening ease, toward the grave. The brothel, where pleasure was sold as a lie. The distance between the glittering avenues of Haymarket and the darkness of Seven Dials may have seemed enormous. But in the end, both worlds often led to the same place, the half-closed door of a brothel. Many believed that once a woman crossed that threshold, she entered a safer, more controlled environment, removed from the unpredictability and violence of the streets. But that belief was one of the great illusions of 19th-century London. A brothel was not a refuge. It was a machine of exploitation sustained by silence, appearances, and the convenient lies society told itself. On paper, and sometimes in carefully staged paintings, it could be made to look orderly. In reality, it was something much darker. Inside these so-called houses of pleasure, life often narrowed into a brutal cycle of debt, fatigue, and dependence. The Blue Posts, for example, operated under the respectable disguise of an upper-class tavern, yet for many of the women inside, it functioned less like a workplace than a trap. They were bound not by chains, but by account books. The brothel keeper charged them for everything: gaudy dresses, cheap face powder, meals, candles, alcohol, and even the bed they slept in. The result was a system in which a woman had to sell herself again and again, simply to pay off the debt required to remain in place. The physical conditions were often appalling. Rooms were small, airless, and overcrowded. Bed sheets and blankets were seldom cleaned. There were no meaningful standards of hygiene, no reliable medical care, no resident doctors, and no serious notion of protection. Hypocrisy disease moved through these spaces with terrifying ease, often faster than news or gossip. The women who worked there were not promised safety, dignity, or recovery. They were expected only to continue working for as long as their bodies remained useful. Yet the images preserved from the period tell a very different story. Paintings of fashionable West End brothels often show women smiling in elegant interiors, surrounded by polished furniture, flattering light, and carefully ordered beauty. No screams, no foul smell, no dampness, no despair. It is a fantasy world without pain, designed to make exploitation look like luxury. But AI, when used honestly, does not recreate fantasy. It recreates conditions: a cramped bedroom, weak yellow light, damp walls hidden in shadow, stained bed linen. A woman sitting alone on the edge of the mattress, just dressed in bright clothing that suggests temptation, while her face reveals only exhaustion, emptiness, and surrender. That contrast captures the essence of the Victorian brothel more truthfully than any painting ever could. Because behind the closed doors of 19th-century London, pleasure was rarely about freedom. More often, it was power wearing a softer face. The brothel did not liberate desire. It organized and monetized it in ways that trapped the vulnerable. When a gentleman paid for an hour of pleasure, he was often paying not only for access to a woman's body, but for the silence of the legal system, the protection of class, and the slow erosion of another human life. These places did not truly sell intimacy or pleasure. They sold an illusion, one wrapped in velvet perhaps, but built from coercion, exhaustion, and ruthless exploitation. Women's bodies and scientific misconceptions. One of the most inflexible convictions of Victorian society was the belief that a respectable woman possessed no sexual desire at all. In the dominant male imagination of the time, the ideal woman was cast as an angel of the house. Pure, dutiful, domestic, and almost entirely severed from instinct. And if desire did appear within her, it was not understood as natural. It was treated as an error, a disturbance, even a defect in moral design that needed to be corrected. Female desire, when acknowledged at all, was interpreted as a sign of deviation. Rather than challenge this belief, Victorian medicine moved to reinforce it, giving social prejudice the language of science. And whenever human instinct is repressed too completely, it often returns in distorted psychological form. By the 19th century, hysteria had become one of the most commonly assigned diagnoses for women. Its symptoms were so broad and imprecise that almost anything could be included. Fatigue, nervousness, restlessness, sleeplessness, sadness, mood swings, irritability, or emotional excess. In places like Harley Street, one of London's most prestigious medical districts, medicine became the setting for some of the strangest and most revealing treatments of the age. What society could not admit openly, it attempted to manage clinically. Many doctors came to believe that women suffering from hysteria required pelvic massage to relieve supposed tension or congestion in the womb. Because the procedure was tiring and time-consuming for physicians, the first mechanical devices began appearing in the 1880s. They were not introduced as objects of pleasure. They were marketed publicly as legitimate medical instruments, presented with the language of therapy, science, and professional care. In other words, pleasure itself was quietly absorbed into medicine, not because it was truly understood, but because society lacked the honesty to name it directly. To do so would have meant admitting an unacceptable truth, that women too possessed sexual desire. The visual culture of the time supported the same illusion. In contemporary paintings, respectable women appear calm, soft, passive, and almost bodiless. There is no visible conflict, no appetite, no private longing. That image was essential to the moral order Victorian society wanted to protect. But when AI reconstructs the actual setting, the atmosphere becomes far more unsettling. A dim clinic room heavy with the smell of alcohol, medicine, and stale air, an oil lamp flickering against the walls, crude brass instruments laid out in shadow, looking less like tools of healing than devices of control. Look carefully at the woman receiving treatment. This is not satisfaction. Her expression is hollow, suspended somewhere between embarrassment, confusion, and a bodily response she has never been given the freedom to understand. When a society is too afraid to face the truth about the human body, it often turns to science not for wisdom, but for authority. In London in the 1880s, female pleasure was reframed as a pathological symptom requiring intervention. Machines were invented to replace understanding, and clinics were used to replace freedom. In the end, hysteria was not really a disease of women. It was the symptom of a civilization deeply frightened by its own instincts, disease, law, and death. The outcome of silence. At this stage, what awaited many people in Victorian London was not freedom, understanding, or protection, but a systematic pursuit carried out under the banner of morality. One of the most enduring myths about the Victorian age is the belief that the law existed to defend public virtue and protect society from disease. But in truth, the law did not stand between sex and danger. It stood between privilege and punishment. It did not ask who caused harm. It asked who could be sacrificed. And that is the question at the heart of this world. Can morality truly exist when the poor are punished and the powerful are protected? This hypocrisy took physical form in places whose names alone inspired dread. In institutions such as the Lock Hospital in Southwark and the treatment wards around St. Giles, the sick were packed into overcrowded rooms where suffering was routine and dignity was scarce. police were empowered to arrest almost any woman they suspected of prostitution, often on little more than appearance or circumstance, and force her into humiliating internal examinations. Meanwhile, the respectable men who had transmitted the disease faced no comparable scrutiny at all. The burden of guilt, illness, and punishment fell overwhelmingly on those with the least power to resist. Inside these institutions, the treatment itself could be as destructive as the disease. Mercury was commonly prescribed, rubbed into the skin, swallowed in compounds, or inhaled in vapor, not as a true cure, but as a poison that slowly ravaged the body. Teeth loosened and fell out. Gums decayed. Faces became disfigured. Weakness deepened. Death often arrived not swiftly, but by degrees. Many victims did not die simply because of sex or infection. They died because of the brutality with which society chose to respond to both. The same logic extended beyond women and disease. Raids on so-called molly houses, including places such as the White Swan, were conducted again and again. Those arrested did not need to commit violence or coercion. It was enough to be seen as sexually wrong. A conviction could mean prison, hard labor, public ruin, or in some cases, death at the gallows of Newgate. The law was not truly concerned with consent, mutuality, or harm. Its deeper purpose was to eliminate those who strayed beyond the accepted norm and exposed the fragility of the society pretending to condemn them. The images left behind from the period often present another story entirely. On judges in crimson robes, police standing upright in daylight, order, authority, discipline, the official face of a society eager to appear righteous. But AI does not reconstruct reputations. It reconstructs conditions. A raid explodes in torchlight. Boots crash across wooden floors. Men are dragged from the dark with terror on their faces. In hospital wards, bodies lie crowded together with no curtains, no privacy, no refuge from shame. A woman in the Lock Hospital spreads a thick white powder over sores that mercury has eaten into her face, trying one last time to preserve some fragment of respectability before death overtakes her. And when you look closely at these scenes, at the sentences handed down in Newgate, at the mercury-soaked wards along Harrow Road, at the machinery of punishment dressed up as morality, one bitter truth becomes impossible to ignore. The law did not punish sex itself. It punished those who were not permitted to have it openly, safely, or without consequence. In Victorian London, a wealthy gentleman could bring disease back into his own home and still remain shielded by status, medicine, and silence. But a poor woman or a gay man could be crushed beneath the full weight of moral judgment. The law was not an instrument of salvation. It was a blade, used to cut away those whose desires were visible but unprotected by wealth. Are we truly different? Or have we simply changed the mask? Are we truly different from the Victorians? Or have we only become better at pretending? The executions once carried out at Newgate are gone. The hospital wards along Harrow Road, heavy with the smell of mercury and decay, now survive only in forgotten records and brittle old pages. And yet, after walking through the dim passages of Haymarket and the suffocating slums of the East End, we are left with a question that refuses to disappear. Has the modern world really stepped out of the shadow cast by Victorian London? The Victorian age was never as sexually restrained as it liked to imagine. What it lacked was not desire. It lacked understanding. It did not yet grasp bacterial infection, contagion, or the realities of reproductive health. Syphilis was treated not primarily as a medical condition, but as a sign of moral failure. It also lacked protection. There were no reliable safeguards, no effective support systems for the vulnerable, and no serious medical safety net for those most at risk. Women and gay men were left to bear the consequences for a society that profited from secrecy while condemning those forced to live within it. But above all, Victorian society lacked honesty. An entire empire performed a theater of purity, discipline, and moral order, while beneath that stage lay a vast underworld of exploitation, disease, coercion, and denial. London knew what was happening. It saw it in its streets, in its lodging houses, in its hospitals, and in its courts. What it chose not to do was name it openly. And perhaps that is the most chilling truth of all. Which part of this story unsettles you most deeply? We often tell ourselves that we live in a more enlightened age. We speak about sex more openly, more publicly, and more scientifically than the Victorians ever could. Social media, public discourse, and modern education all give the impression that silence has finally been broken. But look more carefully. Exploitation has not disappeared. It has only adapted. The red light districts of the present may no longer smell of coal smoke and damp brick, but digital brothels, coercive systems, and human trafficking still operate with a cruelty not so different from the dark alleys of Seven Dials. Nor has hypocrisy vanished. It has simply changed its vocabulary. What was once enforced through silence is now often excused through euphemism, distraction, or rationalization. And power still determines who is protected and who is exposed. Just as wealthy gentlemen in the West End could once purchase discretion, influence, and immunity, so too can the powerful in our own time often buy privacy, escape scrutiny, and shift the cost onto those with the least protection. The polished Victorian illustrations begin to dissolve. The gentlemen, the ladies, the clean lines, the illusion of order. In their place come the harsher reconstructions. Foul slums, tired faces in the Lock Hospital, narrow alleys clogged with fog and fear. These are reminders that true history does not live in the images a civilization chooses to preserve. It lives in the wounds it tries to hide. So we must ask the question honestly. Have we truly evolved? Or have we simply learned to create more sophisticated masks than the Victorians ever possessed? To look back at 19th century London is not to congratulate ourselves on being more civilized. History offers no such comfort. It does not prove that we are more moral than those who came before us. It only suggests that we have become more skilled at concealment, more efficient, more polished, and more professional in the way we hide what we do not wish to face. The streets of London slowly disappear into the fog. One by one, the oil lamps surrender their light, until only darkness remains. No footsteps, no voices, no movement. Only empty space, as if the city itself has withdrawn into silence. And perhaps that silence is the final truth this era leaves behind. The Victorians did not live in a world without desire. They lived in a world terrified of admitting it. That is what makes this history so unsettling. The danger was not sex alone. The danger was the lie built around it. A society that worshipped morality in public while abandoning truth in private. A culture that spoke endlessly of purity, yet allowed exploitation, disease, hypocrisy, and cruelty to thrive beneath the surface. Behind the tightly fastened collars, the rigid manners, and the polished language of virtue stood a civilization deeply at war with its own human nature. And that is why this story does not remain safely buried in the past. It reaches forward into the present and asks something deeply uncomfortable of us. How much of that silence still survives today? How often do societies still hide behind the language of order, respectability, and moral concern, while refusing to confront the suffering created by repression, ignorance, and shame. The Victorian age is not only a historical period, it is also a mirror. And what makes that mirror disturbing is that it still reflects something familiar. History becomes most powerful when it stops being a collection of dates and begins to reveal the patterns of the human soul. So what we have uncovered here is not merely the secret sexual world of 19th century London. We have uncovered the cost of denial. We have seen what happens when desire is stripped of truth, when the vulnerable are left unprotected, and when a society chooses appearance over honesty. Those wounds did not vanish with the fog. In many ways, they simply changed their clothing. So before we leave this shadowed corner of history, I want to ask you something. What truth in this story stayed with you the most? In the comments below, leave a specific quote from this video that struck you deeply, and tell me why it stayed in your mind. I would truly love to know which line felt the most chilling, revealing, or unforgettable to you. And if this journey changed the way you see history, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves the hidden truths of the past, and watch the video below to continue exploring the darker corners of human civilization with us. If you have not already, subscribe to the Reborn Past so you do not miss the next descent into the forgotten, the uncomfortable, and the hauntingly real. Thank you for walking through the fog with me. Until next time, remember this. The past is never truly silent. It only waits for someone willing to listen.